Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lam Museum. My name is Dr. Andrew Gurstelle. I'm so excited that you've chosen to spend your lunch with me today learning about ancient West African archaeology. The topic today is about my own research with a collection of museum objects that were first donated to the museum back in 2003, but have been continued to be donated to our museum, including a box of similar heads just arrived in the mail last week. And so this is an ongoing project. It involves a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different avenues of research. And today I'm so excited to present kind of a holistic story, a broad perspective on these artifacts, what I think they are, what I think they mean, how I think they got here, and what I think we might do with them next. So it's a ranging topic, and I'm going to present it chronologically. I actually, at the 11th hour, literally 11 p.m. last night, I had a change of heart and reversed the entire order of my slides. So we'll see how that works out. Before we begin, though, I do want to acknowledge that the Lam Museum is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of many Native American people. The Catawba, the Sara, the Cherokee, the Lumbee, and many other Native American groups whose names you don't know, but who interacted on this landscape for millennia. Please join me in recognizing the native presence of this land and the close relationship between our topic today of repatriation and the history of museums, collections, archaeology, and Native American people here in the United States. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, this is kind of an informal lecture. All of my lectures tend to be informal. It's just kind of my style. But I did want to make sure that we had a lot of good visual images. So it's more heavy on the images, less on the text. But if you have any questions, finish your bite and then feel free to ask, whatever it is, just jump in and interrupt me. That's perfectly fine. These slides advancing. Also, the slide deck has animations in it, so we'll see what happens. They were preloaded into the slide deck. So we're actually beginning on the timeline, and I want to bring us from the entire suite of this object, from its reality right now, existing here in Winston-Salem in the Lam Museum at Wake Forest University, and bring it back to its origin, the people or the area that was first created and the time period that was first created. But like so many museum objects, our knowledge of that history is partial. There's a lot of gaps that we just don't have exact primary source documentation for. And so I've been trying to find some avenue of research, some kind of comparative sources or other objects with similar trajectories that I can compare the objects on the table, for example, to. But in order to do that, I've started to approach it archaeologically. So back in 2019, you can recall that long ago, we started working on this Bura project. I had recognized when I first arrived at this museum in 2015, my training as a West African archaeologist with an interest in ceramics, I immediately recognized these as Bura-style objects, that the collection of 40 or 50 or so objects that were already in the museum in 2015, that they really were formally similar to this class of artifacts that I had learned about called Bura. The Bura artifacts were ceramic. They had been taken from a necropolis, a funerary site in the country of Niger. They had been discovered relatively recently in the sweep of archaeological discoveries just back in 1975. And so I began to investigate these further. Could I actually identify these as Bura? So to begin identifying them, I went to my training as an archaeologist. Is this giving you like a flashback to the summer? Yeah. So with students, I have been measuring all of the artifacts in here, trying to see, like, yes, are these actually formally similar? Formally, like the actual physical structure, is it similar to these other objects that have been previously identified as Bura? Objects back in Niger that we know exactly what they are, that we know they are Bura. So we've been measuring these, all kinds of measurements, the head width, the head length, all the features of the head, trying to get quantitative data. Is there a pattern between the length of the eyes and the length of the mouth? When an artist creates those features, are they thinking about symmetry? The answer is yes. We have discovered conclusively that yes, they are exactly thinking about making these identical. Even though the length of the eyes vary between sculptures, there is some kind of formal grammar, if you could call it that, that has been applied to all of these objects. We've also been taking a lot of qualitative data, which of course always engenders a lot of fun arguments in the lab. You know, is this a square? Is it a circle? Is it a squircle? You know, these are the questions we have to answer in the lab, right? So, you know, looking at head shape, the eye shape, again, the feature shape, looking at the composition of the clay, at least according to our naked eyes, or a much better technical analysis of clay we can do as well. Looking at evidences of damage and repair. And also just in general, looking at the range of decorative techniques that have been applied to these figures. Probably the most interesting realization that we've had, and now over time we've measured over 130 of these objects in the museum's collection. Every single one of them is unique. While they share similar eye shapes or mouth shapes or a limited inventory of decorative techniques, they are always applied in a unique combination. It was interesting going through the literature that has been published about Bura materials before, and the authors are very hesitant when they say that it appears that there is a tendency towards individuality. And I wonder if that is just because these scholars have just not looked at enough of them. There just aren't that many that exist in collections. They haven't been studied that much. But I will say, based on my research, they do not tend towards individuality. They are inherently meant to be individual. They're so varied and so dramatically different that they couldn't be anything but individualized. That being said, they clearly share some stylistic similarities. This collection that we've been researching was first donated to the museum, as I mentioned, back in 2003, but slowly donated over time. It all came from one single collector, Dr. Dave Rilling, here in the center. Dr. Rilling is a virtuoso collector, right? His main passion in life is to collect art, and particularly African art. His wife, after they were married in the 1970s, they honeymooned in Dakar. And that was their first introduction in Senegal to African art, and they just fell in love. Dave would spend the rest of his collecting years acquiring African art. This is an image he gave me of, this is a second house that they built just to furnish with his African art collection. He has literally thousands of pieces. He would go to dealers and galleries in Philadelphia and New York City, nearby where he lived, and just collected every single year. He would love these buying trips, these annual buying trips, and then come home with a cartload of materials. He eventually was so impassioned by this collector that the dealers knew him by name and would just drive to his house in Pennsylvania directly to come sell him materials. In his own words, he was not choosy about what he collected. He simply collected and acquired. So in 2018, when I started reaching out, researching these objects, and then started my formal analysis in 2019. And this is why I reordered the slide. So I wanted to start with myself and my own story and what I know about the objects, and because everything after that is a little bit speculative, right? It starts to rely on testimony, remembrances, recollections, right? Kind of bits and pieces of information. And while Dave has some knowledge of how these were acquired, he of course doesn't recall exactly. Amongst the thousands and thousands of pieces, the years and years spent collecting, he doesn't recall exactly how he acquired all of these materials. He does know that he started to acquire these probably around the year 2000. And he specifically remembered that these terracotta objects were purchased from not a gallery per se, but a warehouse full of miniature galleries in Chelsea, in Manhattan, in a former site of the mini storage unit. But this mini storage unit is actually home to dozens of different independent African art dealers, many of whom are from Africa, from Guinea or Mali or Senegal typically. In fact, two of the main dealers that Rilling worked with, Hamadou Berete and Abu Diallo, or Jallo, I should say. Abu Jallo were the main two that he remembered selling these specific artifacts. It's interesting because Berete is a is Guinean and comes from a Mande family, well known to be involved, these family lineages, especially among Mande traders, involved with selling African art specifically in the United States. Similarly, Jallo is likely a Fula man from Mali, at least really remembered he claimed to be from Mali. Again, echoing some of these networks of African art traders. So it seems likely that Rilling acquired these objects right directly from these traders, but they had been getting them from somewhere else. These traders were likely not the ones who acquired these objects from the Bura sites in Niger, but rather, they must have been getting it somehow else. The trail kind of goes cold after here. We don't really have any direct evidence from these individuals. Hamadou, while he continues to operate a website, I reached out to him and he doesn't recall anything. This is from 25 years ago, specifically, if you can believe that, right? And unfortunately, Abu Jallo, I've not been able to locate, and I'm not sure if he's still acting or operative in this realm. So the trail has kind of gone cold from here. That being said, I do think that we can use analogies, other stories of African art, maybe not these objects specifically, but maybe we can look at how other African art circulates and analogize that maybe these are parallel tracks, that we can use the same system. We can probably trace this then back at least to 1995 and to the explosion of Bura art like this entering the American art market. In 1995, this was the heyday of the Chelsea building. This is what it looked like back in 2009. It's full of high-end galleries now. But in the mid-2000s, all the African art dealers were cleared out by the police. There was actually a police sweeping of an unarmed African art dealer in the market in 2002, and that led to the slow diminution of this marketplace over time. But, this New York Times article from 2001, as I said, right, thriving in these self-storage units. There's other articles from newspaper reporters going in here and poking around and taking a look, and they say very candidly that you can purchase archaeological ceramics, terracotta sculptures, cheap in bulk in these warehouses, that these are where they are winding up. It's interesting in particular, right? The people they are interviewing are, in some of these articles, are luminaries in the world of African art exhibition. Jerry Vogel, right? A luminary in terms of American art exhibition is quoted in one of these articles as saying, again, very candidly, that, you can pick up ancient terracottas cheap and easy here back in 2001. There has been a sea change, right, in even professionals thinking about what it means to be ethically stewarding these kind of archaeological remains. So 1995, though, is a critical year. While this Chelsea mini storage unit, the scene here starts to get really revved up in around 89, 90 with a heightening of the African art market in general. 95 is possibly when these Bura objects specifically start coming to New York City. This is at the tail end of a major international exhibit called Vallée du Niger, the Valley of the Niger River. A huge art exhibit featuring Nok terracottas, featuring Djenné terracottas, and introducing for the first time to the world Bura terracottas, recently discovered. Following this exhibition from 1993 to 1995, Boubé Gadot, the archaeologist who we'll meet in just a moment, the archaeologist who discovered these in Niger, he himself points to that exhibition, which he participated in, which he facilitated by loaning objects to. He says that exhibit is the reason the Bura sites were destroyed, that this exhibition single-handedly caused demand in the art collecting world for a new class of terracotta, and that the poor infrastructure and the poor cultural heritage protection in Niger. Gadot says in his article, right, it is difficult to blame the Nigerians, literally the poorest people in the world, from appropriating their own cultural heritage and selling it for cash subsistence. But the problem he does not lay with the Nigerians, but rather with the demand, the incredible demand put on by the art market. The demand for these new objects is apparent. Gatto excavates this in 1983. It is the only archaeological excavation ever conducted at the Bura-Asinda-Sikka site. He opens a 20 by 25 meter square block. Any archaeologists in the room? We've opened up 20 by 25 meter squares before, right? Look at you. No, of course, it's a huge amount. You might have opened it. They've opened up that much in Mesoamerica. Oh my gosh, please do it. Again, this is informal. But I mean, again, just in terms of, if you think about plotting individual pieces of ceramics, because this is a necropolis, these all represent burials, right? This is all piece plotted individually. This is a enormous expanse, and this represents just a small fragment of the site, just a small tail end of the site. So Gatto excavates this site, and after analyzing the materials, comes up with some assertions about what was found. However, again, as I mentioned, as soon as these become public knowledge, the remaining portion of the site, which was untouched, unexcavated, again, this is the only excavated portion, has been obliterated. Gatto states that likely between 50 and 90% of the site has been destroyed. This was his estimation back in 2001. It is likely 100% destroyed at this point. There are no known other Bura necropolis sites. That is to say, there are no known archaeological sites with similar styled terracottas. It is possible this was the only site in the world that was used in this way. I should say that all of these pottery that we see here that resemble some of the tubular forms, the globular forms, representational sculpture, these objects all remain in Niger. They're all curated at Ursh, at the museum, the university, and at the National Museum of Niger. So these still exist. These are still reference collections with good provenance that archaeologists could use, that we might be able to compare unprovenance artifacts against. So it's really critical, right, that these museum collections still exist. And in fact, that these museum collections in Niger continue to be supported and maintained. However, the discovery of this site actually dates back to just 1975. Before then, this entire complex of Bura materials was completely unknown. Supposedly, according to the narrative, it was a chance discovery of a young hunter in the vicinity who stumbled across a handful of terracotta sculptures and brought them back to their village. A few years later, they were shown to the chauffeur of a archaeologist who happened to work at the museum, who was related to one of the members of the village. The archaeologist took a look, recognized these terracottas as significant in some way, early Iron Age material, and launched an investigation discovering the site. So this is a site that really had and again, later archaeology confirmed that there weren't intrusive pits or reuse of the site, that this seemed to be a site that had been abandoned and not returned to. Gatto's excavations revealed that the excavation we just saw revealed a range of material forms, some of which I replicated the types on the table in front of us. There are these large tubular vessels. While they are vessel shaped, right, like a pottery vessel that you could contain, as the previous image showed, they were all placed upside down, facing upright. They were also on the surface level of the ground from when they were placed. So they weren't buried necessarily, rather they seem to be markers, right? Surface level markers potentially. They tend to be phallic in shape and accentuated with decorations that emphasize that. Although there is a range of forms as well. Gatto also says that, well, this is the majority of forms. There are also a subcategory of globular vessels. There are also both anthropomorphic and zoomorphic forms. Horse riders and equestrians are pretty common, supposedly, at least within the sample that Gatto ascertained. And our museum does have fragments that up here could have been related to equestrian figures as well. But Gatto also mentions that there are other forms, snake forms, dog forms, potentially, that are represented as well, which are not seen in other collections. These are maybe objects that, while a trained archaeologist was able to recover, the looters maybe did not. We see in looted collections that there is a vast over-representation, and can you guess what it is? Just this part, the head. People latch onto the head, they see the head, they collect the head potentially commands higher value than, say, fragmentary, broken body sherds from these vessels. So even though looters are taking materials and they still exist to some extent, not everything exists. We're definitely getting a lot lost. A bias in sample is definitely occurring. Now that I'm pretty sure that these are Bura objects, right? I've identified them, I've classified them formally, I've proposed a plausible provenance history for the objects, how they got to the museum, going through this collector, Dave Rilling, from his associations with Comedy Verite and Buru-Asinda-Sikka, back to this Chelsea mini market. And then from there, the well-known circuits of African art that bring crates and crates and crates of art from New York, or to New York City, from Dakar, and from Abidjan and Ivory Coast. And then back to the actual African sites where these were excavated from. But what about the actual people? None of this has been archaeology. So if you all came here hoping for cultural history about the Bura people, we're about to start that now, finally. But it's important to preface that we don't really know a lot about the actual Bura people. In fact, the reason I started with this is that we know much more about the illicit networks that these objects have circulated in than we know about the original people that created them. That is the difficulty with using looted objects, is the lack of provenance, the lack of provenience information makes them very difficult to extract the kind of data archaeologists are interested in and can use to reconstruct past societies. That being said, we do know something. We know that around the year 1200, the Bura cemetery site was abandoned. We don't know why. There are no written records at the site. There's not a larger tradition of writing yet at this time period in West Africa. And so it's unlikely that we'll have a lot of textual sources describing the reasons for this abandonment. It's likely that environmental and ecological data could shed light on this. We know that the Earth has been climatically active. There are rises and falls, and hydrology and temperature in the living conditions of different sites, potentially, and this has occurred elsewhere in the Niger River Valley, potentially the climate was not conducive and the Bura people left, or maybe they joined a different political configuration. We see actually that in many cases, right around this time period of 1200, a lot of smaller societies in West Africa seemingly stopped producing the same material traces they had before and are replaced with these larger region-spanning empires. Maybe that is what's happening with the Bura people as well. The earliest context, though, for Bura, what Gatto found through carbon dating and through dating of geological strata, he found that the earliest dates to the Bura go back to 200 of the Common Era. This is a burial tradition, a cemetery then, that was continuously used for 1,000 years, right? A historic cemetery, essentially, that people return to again and again. Maybe not the same groups, maybe multiple groups were using this. Maybe new groups moved in and inherited the cemetery and the traditions. We do see an immense amount of variation and variability in these objects. Of course, the lack of provenance means we don't know what that means exactly. We can't sort them out into groups yet. We don't know if it came from specific areas of the cemetery, specific layers of the cemetery. We just don't know. But we do know that it was occupied for a long time. For this entire length of occupation, this is the fluorescence of urbanism in West Africa, the growth of all of these major cities in the Niger River Bend, right? Going down from Ife and Benin through the Delta, right, to the capital of the Empire of Mali in Niger, all the way on the other side of the bend of the Niger River. And the Bura-Asinda-Sikka site is smack dab right here in the middle, right? So it's clearly that this is happening in relationship with all of these other forms going around it. So what do we know about West African urbanism? We do know that at this point, horses are coming in from the north, imported from North Africa, alongside camels. Cows are already present, having been domesticated in Egypt separately thousands of years before, migrating down into East Africa and then across to West Africa millennia before. Goats are already present. Chickens are about becoming present. They're coming in along with the horses and along with iron production. So this is the iron, which had already been being smelted maybe a few hundred years ago before this, starts to increase dramatically as well. These different technological complexes, those have traditionally been put forward as explanations of why now, why we start to see a rapid urban growth at this time period. Maybe there are technological reasons, right? I mean, even in the Bura material, we see these technologies represented. We see metal jewelry on the Bura figures. We see them riding horses. We potentially see this individuality that may be indicative of status differentiation, of roles in society. That if we were intelligent enough to parse things like this bi-finned, bi-lobed hairstyle, a hairstyle involving wooden hair pieces woven into the hair, a hairstyle which still exists to this day in West Africa, which is almost invariably traditionally associated with a young bride. Could this be all like related to some of these like monarchical hierarchical traditions we see much later in time? Could this be the origin of it some 1,500 years earlier? Potentially so. At the Bura-Asinda-Sikka site, there is no city. I think that's important to note. Cities are circles, but a star means something else. So it's not a city. We definitely know it is a necropolis, right? The vast amount of funerary jars, as Godot terms them, that come out of this suggest that it was a very specialized use of the site. However, he notes that that part of the site, which he terms Asinda-Sikka, is adjacent to a smaller, seemingly residential occupation site, which he called Bura. He dates these as contemporaneously, but it's unclear if that's actually true. The 200 to 1200 span goes for that entire cemetery. And we don't know the frequency of use over time. We don't know if there are major gaps within that time span. We just know that it has a beginning and a termination date. But the village is occupied only very briefly at the beginning of this time period. So what is the relationship between people living there? Is this an ancestral community? A cemetery that has just grown and grown and grown over generations, even as the village has died out, becoming truly just like a necropolis, a city of the dead then? Or is this something different, right? Again, is this like a ritual site that many groups are coming to and using differently, seasonally? I mean, this is a model of ritual sites posed for other parts of the world. Is it maybe something contemporary going on here? We don't know, again, because of the lack of archaeological research. Unfortunately, there is unlikely to be a lot more archaeological research in Niger in the near future. There has been a lot of political instability throughout the Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger area recently, and many archaeological projects have been suspended. Archaeologists working on this exact problem, unfortunately, have shifted gears and both focuses because of that. So, I started at me, and I went all the way back to this supposed origin, 200 CE. In understanding what these objects are, I feel like through the data collection, through the provenance I've uncovered, through comparison with similar objects and similar networks in African art, putting it all on a timeline, I feel like I've ascertained what that all means. But I guess then, if we're working backwards, we think about working forwards too. What is the next story of this collection of objects? What do we do now with these objects now that I've identified them as Bura? Well, one idea is repatriation, is returning them. These objects were not taken as part of a controlled archaeological dig. The only excavation was that large 25 by 20 meter unit I showed you, and all of those artifacts are accounted for. Since the publication of the museum exhibit, Valet du Niger, and the popularization of Bura, these objects have been removed from the ground without any documentation, without any permitting. It is likely a crime within Niger to take these materials. I'm not an expert in Nigerian law. Unfortunately, how international law works, despite it being a crime in Niger, it has not been a crime in the United States to possess or sell these. We do not have a bilateral trade agreement with Niger that would allow the prosecution of Nigerian law in the United States, right? We certainly do not have that kind of bilateral agreement with their government. And it's not illegal in any US law to possess ancient African material culture. And so these enter kind of a legal gray area. Well, not a legal gray area, but, well, I don't know what to say. They're not a legal gray area, but they're not an ethical gray area either. They're just a legal white area and an ethical black area, I suppose. Where the ethical area is, they're unethically collected. They go against all standard archaeological, museum, even art historical ethics in terms of how these objects should be collected. In fact, the most recent article to try to analyze Bura figurines was published in 2020. And the author was dragged through the mud. They, in fact, published a 10-person rebuttal editorial review talking about how this person should not have published anything about unprovenance artifacts. That by researching these, the very act of researching these was making them more vulnerable to predation and loss of information from them. It was a really interesting kind of it was an interesting exploration of what it means to do ethical research in this moment. I'm reducing the arguments a little bit for time, but because I see the people with the most knowledge in the back frowning and saying like, we need more information about this context. Part of the reason was not necessarily just that they were doing any kind of research, but that they would not publish the provenance of the objects. They refused to, like I'm doing, where I'm naming all the names. Hi, Dave. He knows we're talking about it. But where I'm naming all the names, this author would not do that. And they also were not researching these as part of an explicitly restorative or restitutive framework. And so that was kind of where the ire fell. But again, I encourage everyone to read African Arts, the Winter 2020 editorial edition. You can get a wonderful perspective on this issue from many leading scholars. Akin Agundaran, if any of you were here a few years ago for his lecture about Yoruba archaeology, he's one of the authors that contributes to that. But it has been tricky to research these because so little is known. One excavation, that's it, and then everything else has been destroyed. Godot passed away in the early 2000s before he could publish his entire analysis of the work. In fact, the only published analysis is the catalog from that 1993 exhibit that popularized Bura to the world. That is really the only definitive summation of what these materials mean. The objects still exist in Niger. The excavation notes may or may not still exist in Niger, so it's possible that they could still be published. But these are collections that are very poorly known. So what do we do? How do we try to connect these to a larger history and really make meaning out of these objects? My impulse, my idea, and I think the correct one, is to move towards repatriation, returning these objects to Niger so that they can be with the larger, more provenance corpus, so that the center and locus of research is also shifted back to local archaeologists and communities that can have some authority over the research. So to that effect, I've been reaching out to stakeholders in Benin. I've contacted stakeholders at the URSH, the university division that is responsible for art history and archaeology. I reached out to the National Museum, who possess the Bura collection now and exhibit it to the public already at the museum. I've even reached out to the Embassy of Niger in the United States, thinking like maybe a local partner that's already in the US will be conducive to work with. Of course, there's been difficulty. Back in July of 2023, there was a coup in Niger. The military deposed the civilian government, have imprisoned the president, and have taken over the country. As far as I can tell, the university and the National Museum are still operating. They're still effective. They're still participating in the civic life of Niger. They're still conducting research. Their classes are still happening. People are still visiting the museum. Life goes on. The phones are off at the embassy. So I don't know how that's what that is going. But of course, they don't have a government to represent anymore either. The US has declared the government of Niger an official coup, limiting the amount of material support that we can give to the government. So it does raise some interesting questions in how repatriation works here when there are state and non-state actors, contested actors going on, but it's one that we're certainly interested in pursuing. It's also one that we've been anticipating to some degree. So this work in repatriation began back in 2019 with the analysis, working with Susan DeMenil and the AABC, the Arts and Antiquities Blockchain Consortium. We've been actually preparing for this. Not, I don't claim to be having anticipated the coup in Niger by any means. But we were aware that often repatriation, especially of, to developing nations, that there's a lack of critical infrastructure often to care for museum objects. It could even go as severe as an unstable government, one that maybe can't even really make promises about long-term ability to care for objects when they themselves are not a long-term government. And so in order to think about this, we've been looking at how new provenance systems could support this. I've been using that word provenance a lot, right? This idea that could we put out the information in a new way, a new strategy for encoding the information that would prevent it from being stolen again, go missing, right? Get looted in some other respect and wind up back on the art market. So we've called in Ferdinand here from Factor Foundation to perform some photogrammetry, but really the idea is to create a 3D model in any respect, right? There's a number of strategies that could be employed, but the idea is to create digital information about the shape and form of these very objects, with the idea that their shape and form is what gives them value. People want these because that's what they look like. Their very form, their physical presence is indicative of the people that created them thousands of years ago, right? And so by encoding their form, we can have a snapshot, right? A great key that directly links into this one specific object. That shape information is digital, and it can be encoded then on a blockchain, on a distributed ledger. Imagining like a cloud-based system, essentially, of where there's not a single file in one single server somewhere, but rather information that is continually passed back and forth between all of these nodes in the blockchain. So that it's distributed, it's transparent, it's accessible, with the idea being that it's a receipt. If we give this back to Niger, there's now a known receipt, a new link in that provenance chain that says Niger is the owner, the government, right? The people themselves. If these objects were stolen again, they could appeal to that key. This unmutable, unchangeable blockchain code that contains the very shape of the object itself, providing maybe a durable way of demonstrating ownership of provenance. Maybe giving a little bit more security to repatriating materials like this back to, right, a museum operating under a military government, undemocratic military government. It also then, by transforming these objects digitally, it opens up a range of other exciting possibilities that haven't really been pursued a whole lot in repatriation, although Ferdinand has pursued some of these himself. So these are things that are developing over the past 10 years or so. Of course, returning the physical object is part of it. But of course, we also know museum objects exist beyond just their physical state. Museums have wrestled over the image rights for objects almost as long as they've wrestled over the objects themselves. How do these get repatriated too? Legal conventions, certainly, but could we be using smart contracts embedded in that blockchain, part and parcel of this provenance network, to also encode those and preserve those for their stakeholders? Other digital revenue streams, which again could be encoded on blockchain. What if there was a virtual website, right? That imagine someone paid a subscription pass to go to VR museums from around the world. An element of that subscription fee goes to the people who own the digital objects in that virtual space through smart contracts that could automatically be sent directly to the museum. Or what about the data? Those of you who are sharply focused, right, recognize that these are the data lines I was creating. Who owns that data? I guess we generated it, we own it, right? We own this data together, but could this also be data that's repatriated back to Niger? Because that data underlies a whole host of new possibilities. Generated models based off of digital data, of information, not the object itself, but these digital replicas. This model itself, this is a 3D model I generated from this 2D image in less than 1 minute. right? And I could get a fully formed 3D model, not a great one, right? Don't be too much by, but right, the scale of technology is that with no training, no prior experience, I was able to hop onto a browser-based website and under a minute generate that 3D model, right? Or what about physical facsimiles themselves? The ultimate foundation where when we create copies that are indistinguishable for all intents and purposes from the original, could those also be part of the distribution of rights and access? So these are the questions that we are asking right now. Something that I'm working on. Again, this is all hopefully informal because I've been trying to put all of these different sources together. If you know of any sources beyond the ones that I've been using here, I very much appreciate it. This lecture is going to be recorded and put up on YouTube. So out on YouTube, if you know of any sources beyond this that I could use, please do get in touch with me. I very much appreciate it. And thank you everyone for spending your lunch with me today.